less than an hour. We didn't have enough half an hour for discussion.
I'm not sure if this is really needed. Am I audible? What really matters is whether I'm audible to the translator. There is a handout. I hope everybody has sight of the handout. I prefer it to a PowerPoint because I would like you to have quotations that I will be exploiting before your eyes at all times, rather than having disappeared off the screen. There's one quotation in particular that I'm going to talk a good deal about, and I could put it back on the screen if I did a PowerPoint, but you will have it in your hands. I'll tell you as I go along what section I'm in. The handout is divided into sections. So section 1 is just getting going. Question: what is Hegel's phenomenology supposed to teach us? Well, many things, of course, but I want to focus on a program for the work that's set out in its introduction. That's a part of the text that is, as texts in Hegel go, surprisingly accessible, as befits the introduction to a book that's supposed to initiate readers into Hegelian philosophy. And now I'm on to section 2. There's a complication about the idea that the introduction contains a program for the work. I'll mention it now and I'll come back to it at the end. Hegel wrote the preface to the Phenomenology after he'd finished writing the book. But he wrote the rest in order, starting with the introduction. Under pressure from a deadline, he sent off chunks of what he was writing to the publisher as he finished them, and they were set in type. So earlier chunks were essentially fixed, even if he would have liked to revise them in the light of thoughts that occurred to him later in the writing. And now it's known that at some point in writing the book, Hegel changed his mind about the title. When he began writing, he planned a book to be called The Science of the Experience of Consciousness. And at some point during the composition, he switched to the title we have, The Phenomenology of Spirit. This change of mind apparently confused the publisher. In some copies of the first edition, there was an attempt to combine the two titles, whereas Hegel's plan was to shift from the one to the other. As far as I know, there's no firm evidence about what point in the text Hegel had reached when he changed his mind about the title, or about, different, maybe more interesting question, what, if any, change of mind about the contents of the book might have been associated with the change of mind about the title. But it seems reasonably certain that by the time he changed his mind about the title, the introduction was already out of his hands. So it's conceivable that the introduction was designed for a book that would have been different from the book we have, not just in its title, but in containing only some of the text as we have it. And in that case, I'd have to qualify my characterization of what I want to find in the introduction. The introduction sets out a program for our work, but perhaps not for the phenomenology of spirit as we have it. But I'm going to put that aside for now, actually until the end. I'm going to consider the program that the introduction sketches, whatever exactly it's a program for. Now, section 3, and now the quotations on the handout start to matter. Hegel begins the introduction with this remark. I'll read out the quotations, but you should have them before your eyes. It is a natural supposition that before philosophy gets to the business itself, that is, to the actual cognition of what is in truth, it would first be necessary to come to an agreement about cognition. The sentence actually goes on, but that's what I want to focus on. The natural supposition is that the question what cognition is a proper topic for philosophy in advance of engaging in the actual cognition of what is in truth. And over the next few pages, Hegel scornfully rejects the idea that philosophy should begin by considering what cognition is. That, he says, leads to unfruitful doubts about the very possibility of science, that's philosophical science, and it merely postpones what, according to the opening remark, is the real business of philosophy, namely engaging in science itself. Of the ways of talking that the natural supposition leads to, Hegel says on the handout, we would be better justified in sparing ourselves the trouble of taking any notice at all of such representations and ways of talking, through which science itself is supposed to be kept at bay, for they constitute only an empty appearance of knowing, which immediately vanishes before science itself when it comes on the scene. How can science itself come on the scene? It's kind of promised that that's going to happen. Well, that question, in effect, leads Hegel into an initial characterization of his plan for the book. And again, quotation on the handout. But in coming on the scene, science itself is an appearance. In its coming on the scene, it's not yet worked out and extended in its truth. Science must free itself from this character of being an appearance. And it can do that only through turning against it. For this reason, we must here undertake the exposition of knowing as it makes its appearance. So, rather than looking for a prior account of what knowing is, we are to bring science itself on the scene, at first as an appearance, and through the exposition of knowing as it makes its appearance, we are to display science turning against the character of being an appearance with which it first shows up. Now, section 4, it's not obvious what that might mean, to put it mildly. And Hegel at once begins on explaining it. But before I come to that, Hegel's explanation of this idea, exposition of science as it makes its appearance, I want to pause and stress something that I said about this opening of the introduction. His aim at the beginning of the introduction is to reject the natural supposition he begins with. It's indeed natural, it might seem unquestionable, that in philosophy we should concern ourselves with what cognition is before we engage in it. But Hegel indicates that his plan is to do something completely different. In a way he's about to explain, the book will exemplify a way of embarking on philosophical science without a prior inquiry into what knowing is. Now, in a detail that I've so far ignored, Hegel says that on the natural supposition, cognition is conceived as an instrument for bringing what's known within our reach, or as a medium through which we achieve access to what's known. And he frames his description of the bad consequences of the natural supposition in terms of those pictures. And I want to say something about what Robert Brandom makes of that feature of Hegel's treatment of the natural supposition. Brandom describes himself as reading between the lines of the introduction. He focuses on the fact that Hegel is attacking the conception of knowledge as an instrument or medium. And he reads into Hegel's hostility to those pictures a contribution to philosophical epistemology, motivated by an objection that he takes Hegel to find in much previous philosophy, and in particular, quintessentially, in Kant. On Brandom's account, in attacking those pictures of knowledge, instrument or medium, Hegel is attacking a conception according to which a reality that's a candidate for being known must first be worked into a form that it didn't antecedently have, a form that matches the form of the thinking that's a candidate for being the knowing of it. If you think about it, whatever might result from such an operation on a bit of reality, working it up into a form, an orientation towards that couldn't count as knowledge of what was originally a candidate for being known. since ex hypothesi, what was originally a candidate for being known, had a form that precluded it from being knowable. It had to be first worked into a suitable form. So the upshot of those pictures of knowledge is that knowledge of, let's say, an independent reality is unattainable. And from that, Brandom extracts, on Hegel's behalf, constraints on an acceptable conception of knowledge. In particular, a semantical constraint, in the extended sense of semantical. We mustn't presuppose an understanding of how thought relates to reality, on which reality has a form that's alien to the form of thought. And for Brandom, that opens into taking the phenomenology to develop a semantics, an account of how thought relates to reality, that conforms to that constraint. Reality has to be already of a form suitable to be thought. Now, I think the reading of Kant that Brandom attributes to Hegel is off-key, and I think Hegel is a perceptive reader of Kant. But what I want to stress here is something different. Namely, that Brandom ignores the way Hegel's attack on picturing knowledge as an instrument or medium is framed as an attack on the natural supposition, the supposition that philosophy should concern itself, we might say concern itself at all, with what knowing is. Reading between Hegel's lines, Brandom finds a contribution to a kind of philosophical activity, I called it philosophical epistemology, whose aim is to establish constraints on an acceptable conception of knowledge. The question what constraints there might be on an acceptable account of knowledge is surely part of the question what knowing is. So the activity Brandom finds Hegel engaging in between the lines would just be a way of retaining the natural supposition, postponing what Hegel says is the real business of philosophy. In these opening paragraphs of the introduction, Hegel is roundly rejecting the very idea that philosophy should engage in epistemology in advance of doing philosophical science. It's still mysterious what it might be just to set to and do it, but that's what he's saying philosophy should do. In the encyclopedia, he offers an image that would be apt for the attitude he expresses in the passage I'm talking about. He compares what's in effect the natural supposition with the idea that someone who wants to learn to swim should investigate what swimming is before getting in the water. Kant is surely in Hegel's sights when he rejects the natural supposition, but that's not because of a self-defeating feature in Kant's conception of knowledge. It's just because Kant thinks philosophy requires a prior critique of our cognitive faculty. That's Kant's distinctive way of going along with the natural supposition. Okay, I'm now to section 5. Back to the end of the last quotation in section 3. We must here undertake the exposition of knowing as it makes its appearance, a preliminary statement of what's going to happen in the book. If the exposition is only of knowing as it makes its appearance, that makes it seem, as Hegel notes, that the exposition can't itself be science. And we can note, as Hegel doesn't, that if the exposition itself isn't science, both titles for the book are inappropriate. On the face of it, that's true with the title, The Science of the Experience of Consciousness. And describing the book as a phenomenology also implies, in view of the suffix, of course, that it's a contribution to science, philosophical science, that has to be. Later, and I'll get to this, Hegel will disarm the appearance that the book isn't going to deserve either of its titles. But meanwhile, he says, and this is quotation on the handout, from this standpoint, that is, even if we think the work itself isn't science, it, that is, what the book will set out, can be taken as the path of natural consciousness that presses towards true knowing, or as the path of the soul that journeys through the series of its shapes as stations laid out for it by its nature, so that it may purify itself into spirit, in that through the complete experience of itself, It achieves knowledge of what it is in itself. That is, science, that is, true knowing, is the goal, even if our account of the progress towards it isn't science, and so far that's how things look. Well, how are we to understand this idea, the path of natural consciousness? And at this point, Hegel gives a preliminary explanation of what he means by the exposition of knowledge as it makes its appearance. The exposition will start with putative knowledge being brought on the scene in the guise of a shape of natural consciousness. The item that the narration is the narration of the path of a shape of natural consciousness. The claim of this shape of natural consciousness to be a knowing consciousness will be unmasked as mere appearance. Hegel will explain soon how the unmasking will happen, and I'll come to that. Meanwhile, we're told that when it's unmasked as a mere appearance of knowing, the first shape will be replaced by another candidate, which will be unmasked in its turn. Hegel will begin soon on explaining how the replacement shape is related to the shape it replaces. This process in which one shape of natural consciousness gives way to another will go on until the progress towards true knowing reaches its goal. For natural consciousness, that is, for the subject of the modes of putative knowing that the successive shapes of natural consciousness are, that is, as Hegel has so far described it, a path of despair. At each stage, the claim to be a knowing consciousness, of a shape of natural consciousness, will be shown to be unwarranted. But even in this preliminary description of the path of natural consciousness, Hegel presupposes that in its succession of stages, natural consciousness will make progress towards true knowing. And right now, early in the introduction, he offers a first sketch of how the successor shapes are going to be related to their predecessors. That makes room for the idea that the succession is determined and that it's progressive. I haven't put this on, but this quotation: the exposition of non-truthful consciousness in its untruth is not a merely negative movement. At each stage, the result of a candidate's being undone, unmasked, isn't an empty void, it isn't a mere nothing. It's a determinate negation of the unmasked candidate. And he'll give a specific statement of what that means later. I'm letting it unfold as he does. The way a precursor comes to grief will determine the character of its successor, the next shape of natural consciousness. That is, the next mode of putative knowing to make its appearance. Thus, and now this is on the handout, when the result, that is the result of the unmasking of a mode of putative knowing, when the result is grasped as it is in truth, as determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately sprung up, and in the negation, the transition has been made, through which the progression through the complete series of shapes comes about of its own accord. That's a first glimpse of the fact that will enable Hegel to set aside the appearance that the exposition isn't itself science. There's a system in what we now have in prospect is a complete series of shapes of natural consciousness. And the picture is, once it's set in motion, this succession will go on by, as it were, its own momentum, until we come to a shape that passes muster as truly a succession of shapes that tail, and finally one that is at last what all the shapes have been brought into being. Okay, now section 6. That was a sketch, and to begin on elaborating it, Hegel now explains some conceptual apparatus that he will put to use in explaining how shapes of consciousness will be in the book unmasked as mere appearances of knowing. He says, and this is the first quotation under 6 on the handout, I put the German in because I'm going to come back and talk about it and read it out. That which is limited to a natural life cannot by its own efforts transcend its immediate existence, but it's driven out of it by something else, and this uprooting is its death. Consciousness, however, is for itself its concept, and thereby is immediately the transcending of the limited item. I've added the dummy English noun item because an adjective without a noun is hard in English. Transcending of the limited. Closer to what Hegel wrote. Back to the text. And since this limited item belongs to it, consciousness, the transcending of itself. With the individual, the beyond is simultaneously positive for it, even if only, as in spatial intuition, spatially related to the limited item. Thus, consciousness suffers this violence of ruining for itself the limited satisfaction at its own hands. Now, I'll come back to some of the specifics of that passage, but for the present I want to focus on the claim that with the individual, the beyond is simultaneously positive for it. With that talk of the beyond, Hegel's beginning to put in place conceptual apparatus in terms of which he'll explain how shapes of consciousness come to grief. He gives more explanation of this conceptual apparatus a couple of paragraphs later. The general idea, I'll frame it first and then give it the quotations. The general idea is there are two aspects to the idea of an object for consciousness. First, there's the object being for consciousness. That's a being that consists in how the object is related to the consciousness whose object it is. Second, there's the being in itself that consciousness attributes to its object. The being consciousness conceives its object as having, anyway, independently of how it's related to consciousness. The second aspect, second of those two, is what he means by the beyond. In the passage I quoted, the first passage, under 6 on the handout. And now a couple of passages where he spells out that apparatus. Consciousness distinguishes from itself something to which it relates itself. Or, as I will express this, it, that is, the something to which consciousness relates itself, is something for consciousness. And the determinate side of this relating, or of the being of something for a consciousness, is what he says is knowing, and I think we have to put in putative knowing, because this is completely general about shapes of consciousness, even the ones that are not the shapes of knowing consciousness that they're purport to be. So I will routinely put it putative. Back to the quotation. But from this being for another, that is, for consciousness, we distinguish being in itself. That which is related to putative knowing is by the same token distinguished from it, and posited as being also outside this relation. You might say beyond it to pick up the echo of the terminology in the first passage. Back to the text, the side of this in itself is called truth. And again, a slightly later passage which echoes the one I've just read out. There is in it, that is, consciousness is talking about consciousness, one thing for an other, or it has in general the determinateness of the moment of putative knowing in itself. At the same time, to it, still consciousness, this other is not only for it, but also outside this relation. And again, we might say, beyond it, also outside this relation, or in itself, the moment of truth. And that may be just mysterious, but I hope it'll come clearer as I press on. I'm now to section 7, if you're following in the handout, and from here on it's just a series of headings. Okay, now that feature of the idea of an object for consciousness, its doubleness, disarms a difficulty that Hegel notes one might have about his sketch of what's going to happen in the book, the exposition of knowledge as it makes its appearance. If a shape of consciousness is revealed as a mere appearance of knowing, it must be because it fails to meet a standard criteria. But where does the standard come from? If a shape doesn't meet a standard imposed on it from outside, why should the shape accept the verdict that it isn't what it purports to be, namely a shape of consciousness? And so what entitles us to assess a shape by a standard that we bring to bear on it? And Hegel responds by exploiting what he's said about the double character of the idea of an object for consciousness. The standard by which a shape is assessed isn't brought to bear by us, it's internal to the shape. A shape's moment of putative knowing is tested according to whether it conforms to the shape's own conception of its object's being in itself. What in the third of those passages in section 6 he calls the shape's moment of truth. Later I'll give an example, not from Hegel, but I hope will illuminate what that means, but the formal part is the one making that, the standard by which a shape is revealed as not what it purports to be, as internal to the shape. And it isn't just that we don't need to contribute the standard by which a shape is tested. We don't even need to do any testing. Each shape will do that for itself in an activity we need only observe. We will watch as a shape tests itself, finds itself wanting by its own standard, bows out to be replaced by a new shape that's determined in a way we have yet to consider in detail, but that was the material about determinate negation. Determined by the way its predecessor fails. And at this point, Hegel introduces experience, or rather Erfahrung, as a term for this, and now I quote, dialectical movement which consciousness practices on itself, as well as on its knowing and its object. So self-testing by consciousness by a standard internal to what that's experience is a label for that. And he notes, rather carefully, this isn't an ordinary use of the term, Erfahrung, naturally translated experience. In the ordinary way of speaking, experience by all means can unmask a claim to knowledge, but it does so by presenting us with, and this is a quotation, another object, which we come across accidentally and in some way externally. The ordinary use might be exemplified by a familiar kind of case that philosophers talk about, a perceptual experience in which a previous experience is exposed as illusory. Say a stick looked bent, and then it's seen to be straight. When we lift it out of the water, it's partly submerged. A new object we come across as it were accidentally, we didn't need to lift the stick out of the water. Hegel carefully explains that's not how he's using the word that's naturally translated experience. In Hegel's sense, experience is a kind of philosophical reflection in which a shape of consciousness assesses its claim to be a knowing consciousness by a standard that's internal to its own self-understanding. And again, I'll offer a non-Hegelian example of that later. First I'm on to section 8, which will be a lot longer than the heading on the handout. This is going back to the first of the three quotations under 6 on the handout. A passage that begins on introducing the apparatus Hegel uses to explain the way shapes of consciousness will test themselves. That passage repays a detailed reading so far in the class. I'm going to spend some time on it. So this is what you need to have your eyes on. The first of the three quotations on the second page of the handout. The passage begins by contrasting consciousness with what's limited to a natural life. That presumably means ordinary animals, and animals that aren't special, in the way Hegel is beginning to mark with the idea of consciousness on the side of the contrast. Ordinary animals surely have awareness, and their awareness has objects in some appropriate sense. But the being of an object of ordinary animal awareness has only one of those two aspects. the object as being only for the animal. So only as it relates to the animal's awareness, for instance as prey or predator. An ordinary animal doesn't also conceive an object of its awareness as having being in itself, outside that relation. That's echoing the second and third of the three passages. And this is, in the language of the first of the passages, the beyond is not positive if our topic is ordinary animal awareness. Consciousness, in contrast, this is the contrast Hegel draws, is for itself its concept. And I think that means that consciousness is at least implicitly self-conscious. A few paragraphs further on, he says, I quote, consciousness is on the one hand consciousness of the object, and on the other hand consciousness of itself. Consciousness of that which is the true for it, and consciousness of its knowing of that. And that's the two aspects of the idea of an object for consciousness that are put in place in those three quotations. In the body of the text, it'll take a while before we have a shape of natural consciousness in whose self-understanding that feature of itself, self-consciousness, figures explicitly. But even before that, consciousness is at least implicitly in its own conceptual silence. What he seems to be saying here in the introduction is that's characteristic of consciousness just as such. And he's suggesting that it follows that the idea of an object for consciousness has those two aspects, but unlike the idea of an object of animal awareness. In the case of consciousness, unlike ordinary animal awareness, the beyond is positive. Consciousness conceives its object as having being anyway, outside the relation that constitutes the object's being or consciousness. Working on into this very rich text, because consciousness is its own concept, it's immediately the transcending of the limited, and I put in the dumbing down item. What does that mean? Terry Pinkett translates Hegel as saying consciousness goes beyond the restriction abstract. And Robert Pippin, working with Pinkett's translation, takes Hegel to be saying consciousness is always ready to withdraw its allegiance to the norms it conceives itself as functioning under. It conceives those norms as provisional because they are self-imposed. But that all hangs from Pinkett translating Hegel saying consciousness goes beyond the restriction. What Hegel says consciousness transcends isn't the limitation or the restriction, it's the limited. And I supplied, as I keep remarking, a noun to go with that adjectival expression. Well, of course, something described as the limited must be subject to a limitation. But what limitation? The obvious answer is the limitation mentioned in the immediate context, that is in the first sentence of the quotation. Limitation not to self-imposed norms, but to a natural life. So what consciousness transcends, what consciousness is being said by Hegel to transcend, is something that, were it not for the transcendence, would be limited to a natural life. We might say the body of a possessor of consciousness, the locus of a natural life that she isn't limited to, but nevertheless lives. Her body belongs to a possessor of consciousness, just as Hegel says about the limited item. So there's a sense in which, in transcending that item, consciousness transcends itself. That's more of what he says in the passage. And that enables us to understand very straightforwardly the example that Hegel gives of the beyond. Spatial intuition. A subject to spatial intuition conceives an object she intuits, not just as standing in that relation to her, being intuited by her, but as anyway, being at a position constituted by its spatial relation to the limited item. And I suggested that's her body. Or actually, it'd be better to say, to the position a body occupies. That's a way of specifying a place. So as she, the subject of spatial intuition, conceives the object, it would have been where it is, even if it hadn't been intuited by her. And there we have being intuited as an example of the being of an object for consciousness. And being where it is anyway, as an example of the being in itself that consciousness attributes to its object. Now, one more thing about the passage before I move on to section 9, the remark about the limited satisfaction. Well, back to the contrast with ordinary animals. An ordinary animal, something limited to a natural life, is immune to having its object's being for it fail to conform to a conception it has of its object's being in itself. It doesn't have any conception of its object's being in itself. So it's immune to a certain dissatisfaction. And we can describe it positively. It's a limited satisfaction. It's a satisfaction that's limited in a way that reflects the fact that we're talking about something that's limited to a natural life. An ordinary animal is deprived of that limited satisfaction only by death, which, as Hegel says, drives the animal out of its immediate existence. Whereas consciousness, in contrast, is susceptible to that dissatisfaction by virtue of its own nature, by virtue of being consciousness. And that it is consciousness has the effect that it transcends its immediate existence. It lies in the nature of consciousness to be liable to find that its object's being for it doesn't conform to its conception of the object's being in itself. And as Hegel puts it, consciousness loses the limited satisfaction at its own hands. It's because it is what it is that it doesn't have the immunity to dissatisfaction that ordinary animals have. Okay, I'm on to section 9. I've spent some time on that passage, the first of the three, in section 6. But I want to say more about two things in it, so this will be 9 and 10. I think these two things I want to say more about is suggestive towards an understanding of what Hegel's planning to do in the book that the introduction is an introduction to. Okay, the first thing I want to say more about is the contrast between consciousness and what's limited to a natural life. I've said a lot about it, but I want to say a bit more. First, a remark about the terminology. In an ordinary sense, our English word consciousness, or Hegel's German word Bewusstsein, might be naturally applied to an ordinary animal's awareness of things. Hegel's clearly restricting his use of the term to something that is, as he puts it, for itself its concept, and consequently conceives its object as having being in itself, outside how it's related to the subject of consciousness. Consciousness in Hegel's sense isn't something we share with ordinary animals. That's a way of getting at the point of the contrast that opens the passage that I'm dwelling on. However, the limited item, which I suggested we can understand as the subject's body, is still in the picture. It's transcended, but that doesn't mean it's not present. As I put it, a possessor of consciousness lives the natural life. The point is that as a possessor of consciousness, she's not limited to a natural life. And I think what that comes to is that Hegel's topic is animals of a special kind. Not exempt from living a natural life, but that's not the whole truth about them. Early in the section of his encyclopedia devoted to spirit, it's probably better often to leave that in German, but let me say spirit. Hegel says that a philosophy of spirit should aim to reinterpret the teaching of Aristotle's books on the soul. What's that teaching? In essence, a kind of soul in Aristotle isn't a kind of thing, feature of Aristotle's teaching that Hegel loves. A kind of soul is a formally distinctive way of being a living thing. And Aristotle works with a hierarchy of kinds of soul, in which, at a higher level, there are ways of being alive, of which some are also found at the immediately lower level, but some are new as we move to the higher level, in which the shared elements, the elements that were already there at the lower level, are present in different forms. Thus, for an animal, that's the first move up. Being the living thing it is includes nourishing itself, reproducing its kind. Those also occur in different forms in plant life, which is the level below. And for a rational animal, the next level up above animals, being the living thing it is includes life functions that are characteristic of animal life: perception, locomotion, but in different forms, in the presence of further manifestations of life that aren't found in the lives of ordinary animals. That's a kind of quick sketch of the Aristotelian hierarchy of kinds of soul, which is a hierarchy of formally distinct ways of being a living thing. Now, I think spirit, that is what the phenomenology is the phenomenology of, is Hegel's counterpart to what figures in Aristotle as the soul of rational animals. It's a formally distinctive way of being a living thing. Maybe it'd be better to talk spiritedness or something like that. So, spirit. Spirit is a formally distinctive way of being a living thing. The natural consciousness, whose education the phenomenology is going to describe, whose progress towards science the phenomenology is going to describe, is the mindedness, not initially well understood, of a formally distinctive kind of living being. In the encyclopedia, I think it's clear that Hegel thinks the classification marked by speaking of spirit is equally well marked by speaking of human beings. So we can say the task of natural consciousness is to progress to an understanding of what it is to be a living thing, of what is a formally distinctive kind, the human kind. That's kind of sketchy and programmatic, but I'll leave it as such. Move to section 10. The second thing I want to say more about in the passage, the first of the three on page 2 of the handout, is the example of the beyond, the being in itself that spatial intuition attributes to its objects. An arguably sufficient and maybe necessary condition for the idea of a perceptual thing existing unperceived is a capacity to work with an idea of the spatial. So we can say a perceptible thing exists unperceived by someone if it's outside spatial limits on the reach of their experience. And we can say a perceived object, an object that is perceived, doesn't owe its existence to its being perceived. In that, it would have been where it is, even if the perceiver hadn't been, had it quite within the reach of their experience. And that's a version of the conception of the being in itself of an object of spatial intuition that figures in Hegel's example. Being where it is the being in itself that spatial intuition attributes to its objects. Now, in individuals, P.F. Strawson raises the question whether a purely auditory experience could provide for the idea of objects of experience whose existence is independent of their being experienced. We could answer the question, yes, if a purely auditory experience could provide for, maybe not an idea of space, but an analog to an idea of space. But Strawson makes it plausible that a purely auditory experience couldn't do that. And now that could be framed as a case of the kind of failure of shapes of consciousness that's going to drive the progress of natural consciousness in Hegel's group. If the being of its objects for our consciousness is exhausted by their being heard by it. That consciousness isn't entitled to attribute to its objects a being in themselves that's independent of their being heard by it. So if such a consciousness conceives itself as knowing objects whose being in themselves is independent of their being heard by it fails when its moment of putative knowing, that is the being for it of its objects, is tested by a standard constituted by how it's trying to conceive the being they have in themselves. So not an example that's in Hegel, but suggested by Hegel's first example of the and you can easily frame it as a case of the kind of failure it is going to exploit. One remark about that. Hegel frames his account in terms of bringing shapes of putative knowing on the scene and having them find themselves wanting. What Strawson's case suggests is this, and is slightly different. The trouble that's revealed when a shape fails isn't so much that it fails to know its objects, but rather that the being for it of its objects, that is, being heard in Strawson's case, doesn't entitle it to conceive itself as even having objects that are in themselves as it's trying to conceive them. Consciousness, and thereby we, are supposed to learn through a series of failures what's needed for it to be intelligible that consciousness has objects at all. Knowing can do something like dropping out. Okay, to section 11. Hegel says the experience in which a shape of consciousness comes to grief brings on the scene a new shape with a new object. And in explaining that, he gives a bit more specificity to his earlier claim that the negation of a precursor shape is a determinate negation. So that what comes next in the succession of shapes is determined by the failure of what comes before it. When a shape tests itself and fails, it's revealed that what it conceived as the being in itself of its object was not in fact, but only for it, the being in itself of an object it could take itself to know. As Hegel said earlier, this doesn't leave us with nothing. The precursor shape isn't just destroyed, it's determinately negated. And he now explains this a bit further. The failure of the precursor shape determines the object for the successor shape. A new object, he says, is what has proved to be the being only for consciousness of what the precursor shape took to be, the being in itself of its object. A complicated rigmarole there, but that's what he says is determined as the object of the following shape. That's abstract. To make it more concrete, we have to apply it to the transitions in the book. And that's not at all straightforward, and I'm not going to try to do it. What I want to bring out here is just this. At least in aspiration, there's a system to how successor shapes are described as coming on the scene. So, once initiated, the progress is determined because there's that system. Shape comes to grief, successor shape is determined. It comes to grief, successor shape is determined. And that's how Hegel sets aside the initial appearance that since the exposition deals with untruthful consciousness, the exposition can't itself be science. It isn't just that the narration of the series of shapes describes a progress to science. It isn't just that science is the goal. The narration itself is science because of the systematic character with which the series is going to unfold. One more detail. Hegel says the emergence of a new shape of consciousness within its new object takes place, I quote, for us, as it were, behind the back of consciousness. And in the body of the book, that's something I validated. When a new shape of consciousness comes on the scene, it is, so far as it's concerned, just how consciousness is. The new shape has no conception of how it came to seem to us witnessing the experience of its predecessor, that the next shape of consciousness had to be like that. This is how consciousness is all that the new shape supposes about itself. Hegel speaks of natural consciousness as undergoing education to science, but the successive shapes of consciousness are stages in the self-understanding of a persisting natural consciousness, aware of itself as making progress. Only at the end is there a consciousness that can recall the stages by which the regression led to it. And he puts that by saying, unlike the testing of the shapes, which they do themselves, the system in the exposition, and so its character as science, is our contribution to the readers. Organize the thing into a system. Now, remember that the experience of a shape, in the sense Hegel rather carefully introduces, is the self-testing by which it unmasks its own claim to knowledge. So the exposition, as Hegel describes it, we might say, will be precisely the science of the experience of consciousness. In a bit more detail, it will be the science of the experiences of the systematically determined series of shapes of natural consciousness, in the progression that takes consciousness to being itself a practitioner of science. So that gets to the original title as fitting the program set out in the direction. Okay, now the final section. What about the other title? What about the title we have the book under, the Phenomenology of Spirit? Well, that title can be made out to fit the exposition Hegel describes in the introduction, which I've been going through. One of his descriptions of the goal towards which consciousness is to be described as progressing, this is the first of the two quotations, number 5 on the handout, part of it anyway. The goal is that is, consciousness may purify itself into spirit, in that through the complete experience of itself, it achieves knowledge of what it is in itself. And the implication of that is that consciousness will reach the goal, a shape in which its objects being forwarded conforms to its conception of its objects being in itself, when it achieves a full understanding of itself as spirit. And I suggested spirit is a formally distinctive way of being a living thing. Seen from this angle, we can say the shapes of consciousness are going to be progressively improving attempts at a self-understanding for spirit. So, the progress, as already in view, can be described as the phenomenology, science of the appearing of spirit. Spirit appears in these different shapes, and the narration of the experiences of these shapes is science, as in the validation of the first one. All the same, there's something in the text as we have it that's hard to square with the program set out in the introduction. And it's tempting to speculate. I'm going to end with this speculation. I'm not going to talk about other people who speculated, but it's tempting to speculate that a new plan to include this in the text that's hard to fit accounts for the change of title. What I'm pointing to is something in the chapter on spirit. In the chapter on spirit, in the Phenomenology, the transitions are no longer between mere shapes of consciousness. They're between historically actual configurations of communal human life. And Hegel notes that difference. What's going to be happening now is special. Early on in the chapter on spirit in the Phenomenology. His idea seems to be something like this. Full human self-understanding is possible only in the configuration of communal life that's been reached in modernity through a historical development whose outlines he offers. Those transitions from one historically actual form of spirit to another could be described as responses to experiences, self-testings, on the part of shapes of consciousness, in something like the sense that the introduction sets out. But they're strikingly different from the sort of change exemplified by the transitions in the earlier part of the book. Sort of transition exemplified by the shift from sense certainty, which conceives the being for sense certainty of its objects as immediate presence to the senses. A shift from that to perception, which knows that the presence of objects to it has to be mediated by concepts. And it's changes from one mere shape of consciousness to another, what in the spirit chapter he contrasts with what's going to happen in the spirit chapter, that the introduction best fits. For one thing, rather obvious point about the historical transitions, those were surely available to the historical consciousness of actual individuals. They weren't, except accidentally, things that happened behind their backs, but in the introduction of the transitions that the introduction introduces, Hegel makes a point of saying the transitions happen behind the back of consciousness. If we describe the book as the science of the appearing of spirit, phenomenology of spirit, well, that can cover both those historical changes, different as they are, and the transitions between mere shapes of consciousness, which are shapes of spirit, for which the introduction is a better fit. So, if it occurred to Hegel only while he was writing that it might be a good plan to write the material of the spirit chapter, an account of historically actual transitions in the progress of spirit to modernity, that occurred to Hegel only while he was writing. If it occurred to him that that could be part of the description of the education of consciousness to science, that might account for his changing the title to the one we have, and that's bringing the change of title into combination with a hypothesized change of plan constituted by an addition of something to what the book already contains. Well, I've kept it inside an hour. Thank you for listening patiently.
Questions or take notes here who wants to register for questions.
Shall I go ahead? Yeah, just first of all, sorry, Maria, are you translating? Okay. Thank you very much. I found that very illuminating. Do I have to come up? That's right.
Is it possible to detach this
Okay.
Is that all right, Maria? Can you hear me? Good. Let's see if I can read this. Yeah, thank you very much. I found that very illuminating, and I think agreed with very much of it and found it very congenial to the way I look at the phenomenology. I wanted to suggest really just one, what is known in the business as a friendly amendment, which I think might help reduce the difference between the shapes of consciousness and the shape of spirit. And I say this because I'm not convinced that Hegel changed his mind at all. I think the project was clear from the start. And the difference is as follows. And this might just be a matter of wording, so forgive me if that's the case. I think you said at one point that when one shape changes into another shape, it does so because the first shape in some sense fails. And it fails in relation to its own standard of what counts as the truth. Now, yes, that is true, but one could also say that actually the shape is forced to give way to another shape precisely because it succeeds in coming to know what it took to be its own original object properly. So sense certainty doesn't fail, it succeeds in knowing what sheer immediacy is, because sheer immediacy proves to be a complex of many heres and so on. Simply perception doesn't fail, it succeeds. Now this leads to the idea that one shape leads to another when what Hegel describes as the being for consciousness of the first truth gets taken up by the second one. And so one shape of experience makes an experience, the object changes its character, that goes beyond what a given shape is prepared to accept, but the next shape takes it up and develops it. Now if that's what's fundamental to the movement in consciousness, I would suggest that's also fundamental to spirit. And in fact, the movement still goes on behind the back of a shape. So the move from the French Revolution to Kantian morality is not one that was in the minds of the French revolutionaries. It's a logical move that in which the consequences of freedom as it developed in the French Revolution then get taken up by morality. So it's really, I don't think this is at odds at all with what you're saying. I just thought that it might be a slight amendment, and it would shift the emphasis slightly and remind us that there is a certain continuity, although I think you're right, the continuity of the text as a whole, in a sense, really is for the phenomenologist, not for each shape.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. About the historical transitions, I do want to hang on to a difference. I think really in the area of what I pointed to. I mean, you're right. It wasn't in the minds of the participants in one historically actual mode of human life. When it all fell apart, right here we are in a grand Hegelian, at the beginning of a grand Hegelian transition to something new. I meant to be, in a way, providing for something like that by saying the transitions were not unavailable except accidentally to participants in them. So sure, it would be a very implausible degree of self-consciousness in a, I said, a member of the way of living, participant in the way of living that's characteristic of the Roman world. To conceive living like that as somehow how one has to live, given the way the world of Greek tragedy fell apart. But it would have been a feat of self-conscious reflection that would have been perfectly available, because as soon as we've got actual human beings actually participating in history, they have historical consciousness, and it's within their power to be self-conscious about the historical developments that brought it about that things are as they now are. And that does seem to be, I mean, for sure, that sort of historical self-consciousness is not characteristic, but it's there to be had. And that seems to be different from how things are with the transitions from one shape of near consciousness to another. And about that's the second of two things, because you wanted to bring the two things that I get rather separate closer together from both directions. And about the other, the shapes of near consciousness. I absolutely agree that there's a continuity that mustn't be lost, but my inclination is to say we don't lose it if we hang on to the thought, which I'm finding very difficult not to get out of the introduction. I thought that the successive shapes of mere consciousness fail by their own standards. The rightness of the point about continuity is that the next shape, determined as it is by the failure of the preceding shape, cannot be said to leave behind how the preceding shape conceived itself. So focusing on that same example, the successor shape to sense certainty holds on to the idea of its relation to its objects as sensory. Indeed, as involving something like sensory immediacy, immediacy in one sense. It isn't that the conceptions that figure in the self-understanding of the preceding shape just disappear. No, exactly not. They're still there. And I don't think in order to insist on that, on the continuity, nothing is left behind as the thing progresses. We need to lay down the sense in which the precursor shapes prove to be failures. So I'm not sure that I make sense of the idea that sense certainty succeeds.
Am I allowed a very brief? Yeah, sure. Because I realize I'm thinking way too much.
Okay. What I wasn't trying to suggest, I was trying to suggest failure and success occurring at the same time. And what I meant by emphasizing the idea of success was just, well, maybe I should put this differently, that to say that a shape of consciousness fails by its own standards doesn't make it clear that it's that very standard that prompts the failure. That it can leave it, I don't suggest it does, and I don't think in your reading it does, but it can leave it as if there is a standard that somehow consciousness fails to live up to. Whereas I think what is interesting about the phenomenology is that it's the very conception of truth with which a shape begins that leads beyond itself to a further. So in that sense, one could say a given shape is not just failing in relation to its initial standard, it is actually successfully understanding what is implicit in its initial standard and leading to a point at which that standard no longer holds. That's all I was trying to suggest. And on spirit, this is maybe not quite what you had in mind, but of course the historical sequence does break down when one gets to religion. Not within religion, but in the move from spirit to religion, in that it would have been very hard for Kant to see himself as moving forward to an earlier age. But I don't know that that really affects...
No, if I can say something really quickly without the mic. I was carefully silent about the religion chapter, which is the next one after the spirit chapter. I mean, the hypothesis that I was willing to entertain could be amplified. The hypothesis I was willing to entertain about the spirit chapter being added, an amplification of that might include the thought he was already planning to write a chapter on religion. It's just that it was a new idea, that a bit of actual history. I don't think we've got actual history in the religion chapter.
You've got actual history in the unhappy consciousness, the skepticism. You've got the actual history.
Right, that's before spirit. Yes.
Hello. Thanks for your talk. Couldn't we say that the separation of science from appearance is in a certain way a concession to the natural supposition, in the sense that we need to be critical, but the prior way of doing that, involved in the natural supposition, wasn't sufficiently critical, so we need this much more radical development, calling upon certain ideas of the ancient skeptics and so on. But the idea is we can't just jump out of taking into account some of the dichotomies developed in modernity. We have to go through this process. And so you get a different sense of science in the phenomenology from, let's say, the system in the encyclopedia, right? That's my question.
Good, thank you. Look, what I think is true about the progression described in the introduction, it's a sort of plan for a book, and it's up for grabs a bit whether the book executes the plan. But what I think is true about the progression described, anyway, planned for the book, is certainly that it doesn't start from nothing. And that might be a way of emphasizing the thrust of the passages that I spent so long on in my section 6. We're kind of stuck right from the start with a thing that Hegel, someone might say, just plonks down without conceiving this as needing any warrant or justification. Here's how it is with consciousness. The idea of consciousness belongs with the idea of an object. And if it's consciousness, then the idea of an object has to have these two aspects to it. And that opens up the possibility of a mismatch between the two aspects. That's fixed. That's not... what I heard in your question was a kind of contrast between the plan Hegel is setting out and what I think would be a kind of wild idea, over-the-top response to the idea that we must avoid all dogmatism, positivity, etc. We start with absolutely nothing. No, we start with a bunch of concepts that are just kind of in there in the very specification of the concept, consciousness, that puts in place that which is the topic of the progression that we're talking about. But whether that, I think I really don't understand how acknowledging that amounts to a kind of concession to the natural supposition, as you put it. I mean, it's still the case that Hegel can set up a sharp contrast between what you would do in philosophy if you thought the natural supposition was right. What is knowledge? That would be where you began addressing that question. A sharp contrast between that on the one hand and what he's proposing to do, where you don't bother with the question, what is knowledge? I mean, it'll come clear at the end what it is. The thing to do is just to set to and do it, even in a kind of beginning ignorance about an answer to that question, the question that the natural supposition supposes is the first question. So that's just I guess, way of saying I didn't really quite understand the question. Questions?
Well, I guess I have a very general question that's not really directly related to what I have just said. The question is, I mean, first of all, I really know nothing about Hegel, so I'm not going to talk about Hegel. I want to hear from you, I mean, given your philosophical agenda, the kind of problems that you are interested in, I want to know why you are so interested in Hegel, and what do you think that Hegel can, how Hegel or his thoughts can illuminate some of the issues we discuss nowadays, for instance, some issues concerning consciousness, perception, the kind of engagement we have with the world, and issues like that. Do you think that there is something that's new or novel, illuminating in a special way that we can find in Hegel?
That's a really great question, and I ought to have a ready answer, and I don't have a ready answer. I mean, a lot of my interest in Hegel has to do with, just finding the chunks of him that I managed to read fascinating. There's kind of disreputable motivation for some of my interest in Hegel is, this actually came out at moments in my talk, the resistance to things that other people whose work I in many ways admire do with Hegel. So Brandom, I think is just, it's outrageous what Brandom does with Hegel's introduction to the Phenomenology, and I'm interested in saying that. Similarly, Pippin, Pippin showed up briefly. Pippin's got a general line about what makes Hegel tick, the idea of the human as especially subject to norms that human beings impose on themselves in some comical way, and progress, improving understanding of those norms. He reads that into a passage that I really like in the introduction, and I think it just isn't there. But that's a way of maybe beginning on saying something that's in the area of what you're pointing to. What I said, exploiting Strawson, section 10 of my talk. What I think starts to come to light there, and I didn't make a lot of fuss about putting it like that, is something I could say by saying, okay, look, here it looks as if in putting in place this conception of the double character, of the very idea of an object for consciousness, Hegel is undertaking to teach us something about, and now here's a label that connects this with things that people are still interested in. He's undertaking to teach us something about the very idea of intentionality, intentional directiveness. That's what consciousness is, a kind of label for a subjectivity that's directed to objectivity. And it's the beginning of sort of wisdom about how to think about that, to work into Hegel's distinction between the being for it of a case of subjectivity. We start talking about consciousness of its object, and how the subjectivity in question conceives a being that its object has anyway. There has to be that, secondly, for what we have in view to be an instance of intentional directiveness. And I ended that section by saying, all right, here's a way of getting at what the book is holding out as a promise. We will understand that. We will understand how to think about the very idea of having an object instead of a subject. And there's all kinds of concerns in current in philosophy that measures with.
John, I wondered if you could say a little bit more on, it's hard to sort of say what I want you to say more of. It's something about the methodology and the phenomenology, and it's something about
our understanding of the phenomenological we, the observer, and to use a notion that came out of your way of describing what one might call the phenomenological narrator. Because as you pointed out, there's not the resources there in the shapes of consciousness that are being observed and talked about, obviously, in an undeniable sense, to, as it were, describe the progress that they're going through. So it looks like, or it sounds like, there's a narrator there. And should we think of this as the same being as the phenomenological observer? Now, in some sense, I mean, try and search around for images of what Hegel's got in mind. You know, I always come up with the phenomenological observer as something like an audience. They're watching a play, and the shapes of consciousness are these characters. But if the phenomenological observer also has to be a narrator, it sounds like there's something like a critic. They're there telling you, or writing the criticism after the play, telling you what's actually happening behind the backs of the consciousnesses and so on. And if you go down that sort of path, that sort of sounds like it leads to the type of picture that Bob Brandon has of the phenomenology as very, very light on phenomenological dimensions of it, but very sort of heavy on languages and vocabularies and so on. Right? So the shapes of consciousness now become fragments of a language, made up of for chapter 1 it's demonstratives or something like that. And then the worry, going down that path, the worry becomes the type of criticism of the phenomenology as a project that you get maybe in people like Rolf Borschmann, who says, well, if the narrator is in it from the beginning, the narrator's already got the language that is supposed to come out at the end of it. So it's all really just it's not succeeding in the terms that Hegel claims for it to succeed. I've always tried to resist that type of criticism of the phenomenology, but if you go down the sort of language path, it's hard to see what's wrong with it. But if you don't go down the language path, it's hard to make a lot of sense of how the phenomenological observer is, as it were, how the experience of the phenomenological observer is sort of made into something coherent.
Well, great, thank you. Excellent question. Insofar as I said anything at all about it, this gets at a bit. I mean, I noted something that Hegel says, and really I ought to be more uncomfortable about his saying this than I confessed to being when I mentioned his saying it. The thing he says is the system in the exposition is our contribution, and that's our possessive from the phenomenological we, as you were putting it. The idea of our contribution, who exactly makes a contribution, that's what you're getting at. I really do like the image of things happening on a stage. I mean, quite often it's quite reasonable to translate expressions that Hegel uses. So by saying things like such and such comes on the scene, right? So work with that picture. A shape of consciousness is on the scene, saying, here's how it is with me. And then it tells you the story about consciousness conceiving itself as self-conscious. Here's how it is with me. the two aspects of my conception of my object, or my objects, are as follows. Now let me think a bit about whether the being for myself of my objects comes up to scratch by a standard constituted by how I conceive the being in itself of my objects. Thinks a bit and thinks out loud a bit and fetches up saying, oops, I'm no good. You know, sorry guys, bows to the audience, walks off. And then another one walks on and says, not conceiving itself as needing to walk on because the other one walked off, but it says, here's how I am consciousness as perception, here's how I am, and so on, right? So, and then there isn't any party to these goings on except the successive shapes going through their own reflection about their own credentials as what they purport to be, which is what Hegel calls experience. And as it's natural to say, working with that image, the audience, that's the phenomenological we. It absolutely isn't, as I'm describing it, that there is a puppet master controlling everything. Hegel has a story according to which what has to be the character of the second member of this dramatic performance. What the character of that has to be, it's determined by we watching understand. Oh yes, this is how the next one has to be, and then we watch the next one, finding itself wanting, and again the third one comes in, and we understand. Yes, this is how it has to be. It all happens of its own accord, I think he says, by its own momentum. Once the thing has been got going, no need for some figure called the narrator, about whom we could say in this kind of debunking way, oh well, he knows where it's going. Nobody needs to know where it's going until it's got there. All there is the successive players on the stage, and us watching what goes on. And then, insofar as any narration is called for, we might be sitting there in our seats in the theatre making notes. First, self-consciousness came on the scene and found itself wanting, and this was how that happened. Then the necessarily successor shape, perception, came on the scene and found itself wanting, and this is how that happened. It's almost that one should say something like the book writes itself as we're going along, with no mind being up front, knowing what's going on, knowing where the thing is going, so that the whole idea of a progression is a fraud. No, it isn't a fraud. It's going where it's going to go, and that's inexorable. That's fixed by the characterization of what's going to happen. But it's fixed by the characterization of what's going to happen in such a way that exactly what the stages that the thing is going to have to go through are. It unfolds as we proceed. I think I didn't understand in your question was how what you called going down the language route somehow constituted a response to this question about a relation between a narrator and the observers, which would be congenial to the idea that the narrator is more like a puppet master, and the narrator really knows where it's all going. I think I just didn't get that. Sorry.
It wasn't it wasn't a sort of a deep point, I think, but only if one started to think of the shapes of consciousness as somehow limited to, fragments of language, let's say, this table, read, those sorts of things. And the story being told is on the language side, just the sort of inadequacies of such a conception of that functioning as a language and needing to be supplemented by something more complex again, more complex again. And then the type of, I guess, the version of the horseman sort of question I had in mind was, well, the whole thing is being described in the type of fully blown language that, the big grammar that it ends with. That was the
Time for one more.
I think it's very similar to Reddy's question, but
according to some authors, Hegel has an ontology, but not a semantic. Semantic understood here as a relation between the language and the reality. Then, according to this, how do you answer by Hegel thought a relation between consciousness and reality, considering an ontology but not a semantic?
Okay, thank you. Look, if it counts as having a semantics that one concerns oneself with, I don't know, the relation between thought and its topic. The idea that Hegel's concerns are exclusively ontological, not semantical, strikes me as just absolutely not fitting. Already the progression that he describes in the introduction to Phenomenology, not fitting all kinds of stuff in Hegel. I mean, at the beginning of the logic, thought is of being, and then quite quickly it turns out that that's not a stopping point. But so I'm really not sure about the presupposition of the question. Some people say, you say, some authors, Hegel has ontology and not semantics. I'm worrying about the presupposition of the question. The idea that he's not interested in how thought relates to its topic, that strikes me as obviously wrong. I mean, really obviously wrong. How does a thought with that shape impinge on what I'm trying to find in the Phenomenology? Well, not at all. We don't need to think about a thought with that shape. And in a way, the progress in the Phenomenology as I'm thinking about it, but focusing now on what I got out of the comparison with Strawson. At some really general level, what the Phenomenology is about is the very idea of consciousness having objects. Well, that's at a general enough level, a semantical idea. It looks clear that I'm not responding to your question.
I guess we should stop here. John, thank you so much for an excellent talk. We